oppression and deception, including their reported intention to fabricate a pretext for a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. But most importantly, he emphasized that the Kremlin can still make the choice to avert disaster.
We believe that they will target Ukraine's capital, Kyiv, a city of 2.8 million innocent people. We're calling out Russia's plans loudly and repeatedly, not because we want a conflict, but because we're doing everything in our power to remove any reason that Russia may give to justify invading Ukraine and prevent them from moving. The American people are united. Europe is united. The transatlantic community is united. Our political parties in this country are united. The entire free world is united. Russia has a choice between war and all the suffering it will bring, or diplomacy that will make a future safer for everyone.
The president also reiterated the news that Russia's foreign minister agreed to meet with Secretary of State Antony Blinken in Europe next week, but said any military action before that date will slam the door shut on diplomacy. This comes as Russian provocations continue to exacerbate the already tense situation. According to U.S. officials, Russia now has as many as 190,000 troops amassed at Ukraine's borders. And NBC News reports tonight that up to half of those forces have now assumed attack position. The United States has also shared new intelligence tying Russia to the cyber attacks that were launched against Ukrainian banks this week. Meanwhile, ceasefire violations continued along the front lines, where the shelling has been described as the most intense since 2015. And in an ominous sign of a possible attack to come, Russian-backed militants announced an evacuation of civilians from the territories that they control in eastern Ukraine. Amid all of this, Putin is also trying to stoke fears of nuclear war. He's chosen this moment to announce that he's staging military drills to test Russia's nuclear delivery systems, and he plans to supervise the launches himself. This comes after Putin unveiled what he called invincible nuclear weapons in 2018, and after he endorsed a new first strike policy in 2020, justifying their use in a conventional war. Joining me now is Russian opposition politician Vladimir Kara-Murza, Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman, former director for European Affairs at the U.S. National Security Council and senior advisor to Vote Vets, and NBC News reporter Matthew Bodner, who is in Moscow. And I'm going to start with you first, Matthew. Give us sort of the read on the ground tonight, at least on the Russia side.
Thank you, Joy. Yes, well, we have seen a bit of a sea change in the Russian narrative today, and it's concerning, and it's basically all of the things that we were hoping we would not see. Starting this morning, as you mentioned, with the announcement by the heads of the two breakaway statelets in eastern Ukraine that they were conducting or organizing mass evacuations of their civilian population. We saw actually Russian President Vladimir Putin very quickly swoop in to offer support to these, refugees, saying that they are welcome, that Russia will provide them with some money, about $130, medical assistance if needed, hot food. He sent his emergency situations minister down to Rostov, that is the Russian city just on the other side of the border from that region. This has come with a massive kind of uptick in coverage on this issue in the Russian state media. Basically, it is now wall to wall on this idea of evacuations of the civilian population from eastern Ukraine because of an imminent Ukrainian military attack on the region. We're seeing also, of course, officials, opinion leaders, all kind of starting to sound off on using in kind of the harshest rhetoric the term genocide to describe what they say is being done to the Russian-speaking population, for example, in those regions. We're also seeing reports that we can't confirm, but they are being kind of spread widely in the Russian media right now, of an explosion in central Donetsk, the capital of one of the regions, and two explosions now, it seems, at least they're claiming, at a gas pipeline in Luhansk. That is the other region. So it's kind of out of, basically all today in the past 12 to 24 hours, all of the things we were hoping we wouldn't see.
Yeah, Alexander Vindman, let me play what Vice President Harris had to say today in meeting with NATO Secretary and then with the NATO Secretary vowing sanctions.
We remain, of course, open to and desirous of diplomacy as it relates to the dialogue and the discussions we have had with Russia. But we are also committed, if Russia takes aggressive action, to ensuring there will be severe consequence in terms of the economic sanctions we have discussed.
give us your read here, just from a sort of from a national security sort of perspective, because it does seem that the administration has been very proactive about presenting every possible thing that Russia could try to do to try to get away with this and make it look like they were simply defending the people in the Donbass region, or that they had some reason to do it. Yesterday, Secretary Blinken highlighted all of these different possible false flags. We can put them up on the screen: a fake terrorist attack, an invented discovery of a mass grave, a staged drone strike, a faked attack with chemical weapons, claims of ethnic cleansing. They're throwing every possibility out so that at least outside of Russian state media, they won't be able to pretend. Blinken also said that he believes Russia was surprised by how the West has held together. What do you make of all this and the potential and likelihood that this really will happen?
Well, I think it's a good effort to try to limit the options that Vladimir Putin has. I think it probably has effects on the margins. So if he had a whole universe of different possibilities that he was going to do as false flags, as these pretexts for war, they're going to try to narrow down those options. But it doesn't really make that much of a difference, because Vladimir Putin will just fabricate something, as he's doing right now with these claims of genocide and these explosions, claiming that there's an offensive from Ukraine. I think what's fascinating is how much evidence the president and the U.S. government had to assemble in order for the president to declare that Russia is going to conduct this offensive. Now, I mean, having served in the military, I understand all those assets that the U.S. has brought to bear. That there's all sorts of signals intelligence. There are air assets that are collecting tactical operational information. These communications that the Russians are doing as they position their forces. But for the president of the United States to declare that this is going to happen should leave no doubt of where we're headed. And I think even if we avoid this or pulling in NATO, we'll find ourselves in a new Cold War. So avoiding this hot war, we will find ourselves in a new Cold War. We will face the reality of a belligerent Russia seeking to upend the international system. And this is going to have geopolitical implications, economic implications for China, domestic economic implications here. And I think we will be dealing with this for years to come.
Vladimir Karmelin, sir, I don't ask you to psychoanalyze Vladimir Putin, but come as close to it as you feel comfortable doing. I mean, this is someone who will completely be isolated if he were to do this. It's very clear that this pipeline that they very much want to do to get Russian natural gas into Europe would be finished. He could be isolated from the access. Russia could be isolated from access to the financial markets. You were one of the people who pushed for the Magnitsky Act. He could receive personal sanctions. There's so much that could be done. This seems like economic suicide, and also at some point you can't hide the Russian body bags that are coming home to their families. How do you even maintain this oligarchic system and this sort of, autocracy, given the pain that you would be inflicting on your own people? I don't understand it. Do you?
Well, Joe, you're trying to sort of speak from the point of view of normal human logic, and that is, of course, not the logic of dictators. Let's not forget Vladimir Putin has been in power for more than 20 years. The first thing he did when he did come to power was to destroy the major independent media, shut off opposition, rig elections to make sure that it's a completely controlled authoritarian system. So for many years he has existed in this sort of bubble that his own propaganda machine has created, with no checks and balances, no opposition, no significant independent media to speak of. And, I think at some point, a dictator who is in such a position for such a long time really starts to lose the sense of reality. And so the normal rules of logic that you're trying to appeal to simply do not apply. And let's also not forget that this is a classic page out of a dictator's playbook to try to sort of create a foreign war to distract society's attention away from domestic problems. We have a stagnant economy in Russia for many years. We have real incomes that have been falling for year after year after year. We have shrinking space for civil society and political freedom, shrinking literally by the day now, not just by the week. And we have a young generation of people in our country who increasingly see no prospects and no future for themselves or for our country as a whole under this corrupt authoritarian kleptocracy. that Vladimir Putin has created. And let's not forget also that Mr. Putin faces a really big problem in 2024, when he will likely attempt to stay in power at the end of his final term in violation of a term limit, which he tried to unlawfully overturn in a series of sham constitutional amendments a couple of years ago. There's growing international realization as to just how illegal those constitutional amendments were. So all of this creates a situation where the Kremlin feels they need some sort of a distraction. What has been termed in previous historical eras a small victorious war. That's a term that comes out of the Russo-Japanese War in the early 20th century. As we know, that backfired very badly on the people who tried to stage it, as did, for example, the Afghanistan invasion for the Soviet Union in the 1980s. So, it has worked for Mr. Putin before with Georgia. It has worked with him certainly in Crimea. But, sometimes for these dictatorial regimes, there can be one small victorious war too many. And I think that's a serious risk for the Putin regime right now.
Welcome back. Panelists here. Yamiche Alcindor, moderator of Washington Week on PBS, NBC News Pentagon correspondent Courtney Cuby, Washington Post White House bureau chief Ashley Parker, Wall Street Journal columnist Peggy Noonan, and we're also joined by William Taylor. He's the former U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, and so, Ambassador, I want to start with you. You have a lot of insight into the Ukrainian government. Zelensky, this is one fired up leader of his country, frustrated, and he seems to be as frustrated with the West as he is with anybody.
No, Chuck. He's clearly frustrated with Putin. He's got allies. He was there addressing those allies in Munich yesterday, exactly what you say. He's got complaints about more support, he would like to have. But the real villain of the case, let's be clear, is sitting in the Kremlin.
Is there when you hear about this, anything to do to stop war, is there anything reasonable to discuss between Ukraine and Russia?
Probably not between Ukraine and Russia. There's reasonable discussions to be had between Russia and the United States. The Russians are after things that Ukraine can't really deliver. The Russians are after a rollback. The Russians don't want NATO to accept
Ukraine's just a pawn, right?
Ukraine has a gun to its head while the Russians are negotiating with the Americans and NATO and others. And so, yes, they're a pawn in this.
Courtney, I think what we're all wondering is, what's next? We know how we're going to respond to sanctions, to a Russian invasion. We know all that. What's next for the American response after that?
There is, from a military perspective, there really is no response. I mean, right now, the Biden administration has made a very concerted decision that there will not be any kind of U.S. military response. And people keep coming to me and saying, well, what if Americans are killed? What if Americans need help getting out of the country? I think people are going to be pretty surprised. There's a lot of comparisons back to Afghanistan, but this is
Secretary
not
Blinken
Afghanistan.
said it. Hey, we're not getting you.
Yes, they are. There has been a real effort on the part of the Biden administration to tell Americans, if you are there, get out. The idea that the U.S. military will be in Ukraine fighting Russia is just not happening. Unless Vladimir Putin decides to branch this out and to go into Poland or anything, but there's no intelligence that suggests he's made that decision.
And just following up on that, I mean, I think Afghanistan looms so large there. And in talking to people in the administration, they say that getting Americans out is so top of President Biden's mind. He mentioned it in that Super Bowl interview. He mentioned it when he had the press conference with the German chancellor. He mentioned it in his speech last Tuesday. Not that Americans are going to evacuate, not that the U.S. is going to evacuate Americans there, but that's why you see them saying, you need to get out now. You need to get out when commercial flights are still available. They came up with a plan where there'll be U.S. troops on the border with Poland. Well, that can be an 8 or 9 hour trip across land, and they do not want another situation like Afghanistan where you see those images that really hurt them with the American public.
What kind of American resolve is there going to be, Yamiche?
American resolve? I mean, I think
we're watching this happen, and we're with the Ukrainians now. How long are we going to be watching?
I mean, that is the big question politically. It's also why we see, as Ashley and Courtney said, Afghanistan looming so large, because we did see President Biden's poll numbers tank after the Afghanistan withdrawal, which he defended and continues to defend, but they did not go back up. What I hear when I talk to White House officials is this real feeling that President Biden is sharing as much intelligence as possible. A key element of the West's strategy here is to warn people internationally about what Russia's doing. But also, the thing that you hear President Biden saying is Americans need to be prepared for if this comes to our shores, and it comes to our shores in the effect of higher gas prices. When we already are seeing an 8-year high, we're already seeing inflation at 40-year highs. So the president is also trying to tell Americans, if we have to get involved here, the cost of freedom may be in your wallets at the gas tank.
You know, and Peggy, I think this is the president's challenge. I think I'm impressed by the lack of partisan bickering there's been about how he's handled this, right? And that's
I think that's
see
true.
that there is, so you could see that there is agreement that he is doing everything he should be doing right now. The question is, if this strategy doesn't work, is it Katie bar the door?
Well, we'll find out. Maybe find out pretty soon in the next few days or week or so. It does seem to me in general that the West, as it used to be called, or perhaps the administration, I don't know enough to say it's the White House, but somehow the West is kind of playing a not so great hand about as well as they can play it, you know? NATO has stayed together. There's bickering, there's differences, there's 20 members, but they're kind of being unified. Zelensky's been a strong guy, seeming a little detached from the U.S., being a little critical, but being majorly, wow, please don't invade us, that would be a bad idea. It seems to me it's also the U.S. tactic of showing its intelligence and telling everybody this is what we're seeing, 190,000 troops now. This is where they're moving. That's been smart. It's alerted the world, but it's focused the world. So I think so far, next week I may regret this, but so far I think they're playing their hand pretty well.
You know, Bill, I think the thing that seems to be rattling a lot of people is the unknown is Putin himself. I want to put a piece of this New York Times analysis up. In Moscow, many analysts remain convinced that the Russian president is essentially rational. But some also leave the door open to the idea that he has fundamentally changed amid the pandemic, a shift that may have left him more paranoid, more aggrieved, and more reckless. You know, because you and I were discussing earlier, there is no rational, this seems irrational if he does this. But what if he's not rational?
He may not be rational. He's looking for an excuse. You're right, Chuck. He doesn't have a story to tell the Russian people. He doesn't have a story to tell the international community. He has no rational reason to go to invade Ukraine. The fact is, he has told his people that Ukrainians are kind of really Russians. And so he's got a story to tell, and he can't find one. He's trying to provoke one, so far without luck. However, he has also said many times, and his staff have said, Roth has said, we're not really trying to Ukraine. We have no plans to invade Ukraine. We're not really. He can back off that way. He can say we never intended in the first place, and he can say it's really a success because the Americans have finally agreed to address my concerns.
Right.
I think if he does back off, there is also this destabilization that we've already seen in Ukraine. I was looking at Rachel Ingalls' live shot and thinking the people of Ukraine probably don't want to even look at that because President Zelensky is saying the more we talk about war, the more we talk about the imminent threat, the harder it gets for the Ukrainian economy, the harder it gets for people in Ukraine to remain calm. That is the tension between Ukraine and the West here, which is that they are trying as best as possible to share as much information. And the president of Ukraine is essentially saying this is destabilizing my country, and even if there isn't an invasion, there's already been damage done to my country.
But you have to remember one thing, is who's destabilizing the country? It's not the United States that's destabilizing Ukraine. It's the Russians. Let's be clear. It's President Putin.
We're just telling them the story.
We're saying what's happening.
I think it's so fascinating that people say that Vladimir Putin is not rational. In July, he wrote this long op-ed where he laid this out, what he wants to do. So, I mean, you know, there's this notion that he's been telegraphing this for months, and you could make the argument he's been telegraphing it for years.
I was just going to say, go back to 06.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of his primary national security objectives and long-term strategic objective is to take Ukraine and then to keep moving to Kaliningrad. Belarus, Moldova. Some of the places that we, in some ways, we're already looking at as almost Russian territories, right? So this is something he's been working on. This is a legacy event for him if he decides to do this invasion, and it's something that it will continue his goal of turning this global order.
Bill, address the question that I said to the Secretary about what's the assessment of why Putin didn't do this while Trump was in office?
You know, I think the question of why now is a very good one. He may think that he's running out of time. Maybe he thought he had more time when President Trump was in office. But he's running out of time. The Secretary made this point, that is, Ukraine's moving inevitably, inexorably to Europe, away from Russia, because of all his actions on that thing. So I think he's running out of time in that way. Also, this is probably the peak strength of his military. Yeah. His economy is not in good shape, and it's going to go down from here.
Can I say
one last thing? Yeah.
Just very quickly. I think people, especially Americans, are wondering if Putin moves on Ukraine, if he goes as far west as Kyiv, what does that look like? What is that? What does that mean? Does he stay? How bloody, but also literally, what does it look like? And is it formal troops and tanks? Is it little green men? Whatever. Second question, of course, spillover. What does that mean beyond where it's taking place?
That's what a lot of Eastern European NATO allies would like. Ambassador Taylor, thanks for joining us. It's great to have you.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.
Earlier this week, the San Francisco Board of Elections, there was a recall effort there, and 3 of those school board members got recalled. Now, there's a lot of ideas about what was the reason for this. Was it parent frustration over COVID? Was it frustration over so-called woke politics? I can tell you this, there's been a lot of phrases written this way over the last week. Even San Francisco, even in progressive San Francisco. So, what is the real story here? Let us bring in the mayor of San Francisco, London Breed. London Breed was a supporter of these recall efforts. Mayor Breed, welcome to Meet the Press.
Thank you.
Let me start with, everybody has an opinion about what happened, but I want to ask yours, but I want to put up San Francisco Chronicle on Wednesday said it was a plea for basic competence. Newsweek said it's a wake-up call for progressives. The New York Times said an awakening in the Chinese American community. I could take it a step further. Joe Garrett-Foley sort of downplayed it and said this: Tuesday's overwhelming recall of 3 school board members isn't a sign that San Francisco is marching lockstep with the conservative trend of parents taking back their schools. It was about one school board race in one city and an off-year election in mid-February. So there's all these array of takes. Mayor Breed, what's yours?
Well, my take is that it was really about the frustration of the Board of Education doing their fundamental job, and that is to make sure that our children are getting educated, that they get back into the classroom, and that did not occur. They were focusing on other things that were clearly a distraction. Not to say that those other things around renaming schools and conversations around changes to our school district weren't important, but what was most important is the fact that our kids were not in the classroom. And San Francisco, our Department of Public Health, we've been a leader during this COVID pandemic. And in some cases, we have put forth the most conservative policies to ensure the safety of all San Franciscans, and our vaccination rates and our death rates and other numbers demonstrate that we are a clear leader. But we failed our children, parents were upset, the city as a whole was upset, and the decision to recall school board members was a result of that.
Now, there's been some speculation that the only reason 3 were recalled is 3 were eligible, and that had more been eligible, perhaps more would have been recalled. You're going to be appointing the replacements. That power is in your hands. What kind of person are you looking for? What should their priority be? And what message should the other school board members take away from this recall success?
Well, I've been talking to parents for the past couple of weeks, and what they want is someone who is going to focus on the basic fundamental responsibility of members of the school board. And that is making sure that children get the education that they need in our schools, dealing with the challenges of learning loss, dealing with the mental health challenges that exist. We have a significant budget deficit. We need to hire a new superintendent. So I'm going to be looking for people that are going to focus on the priorities of the school district and not on politics and not on what it means to run for office and stepping stones and so on and so forth. We need people who want to be on the school board to make a difference and who meet those qualifications to do the job.
One of the ousted members said this: white supremacists are enjoying this, and the support of the recall is aligned with this. Is that the right kind of reaction to what happened?
Well, of course it's not the right kind of reaction, and the fact that we're still even listening to any of the recalled school board members is definitely a problem. Again, we should be focused on the parents, we should be focused on the school district and the challenges that these kids have faced, and that's the biggest problem. This person is making it about them when it really should be about our kids who have suffered, not just in San Francisco, but all over this country as a result of this pandemic. And let's be clear, in San Francisco, for some time now, our private schools were open even when our public schools couldn't get it together. So we have a lot of work to do, and the focus needs to be brought back to our children, and that's my goal in appointing some additional school board members to do just that.
Look, there's been a lot of, some people want to say this is about, you brought up the focus and priorities about keeping schools open. A lot of national people have made note that they wanted to rename schools. How much of this was about renaming the schools of George Washington and Abraham Lincoln and Dianne Feinstein? How much of it, though, was also parents upset that the rules were changed and how you got into some specific magnet schools?
Well, I think it was probably both, but at the end of the day, our kids were not in school, and they should have been. And kids were home suffering. The stories that I heard about children who went from being these bubbly, exciting kids to not even smiling, to being depressed, the increase in the number of suicide attempts and other things that exist, that is the fundamental problem here. And I think that we have to get back to that. And yes, of course, there were people who were probably upset about some of the proposed changes, but those are discussions that are important to have, but not at the expense of making sure that the priority of what the school district is there to do is met.
Any advice for Democrats around the country in urban settings that are dealing with this, dealing with upset parents right now? What lesson would you say should apply?
Well, this is not a Democratic-Republican issue. This is an issue about the education of our children, and I think that ultimately it's important that anyone who serves in any capacity, whether it's school board or Congress or as mayor, it's important to respond to what your priority is as a mayor or as a school board member, and that is the role that you were put in the office to do. And so in this particular case, the board neglected their primary responsibility to focus on other things that are important but not as significant as what they were there to do, and that is to educate children.
I want to bring up another issue that you were pretty exercised about, and was the rise in crime in San Francisco. On a place of remarks you said a couple months ago that really struck me. Here it is.
It comes to an end when we take the steps to be more aggressive with law enforcement, more aggressive with the changes in our policies, and less tolerant of all the bull that has destroyed our city.
Obviously, it was some of those, we've seen the footage of some of these sort of group shoplifting robberies, things like this, and even worse. And you wanted to get a bit tougher. You've got a district attorney in Chesapeake who you did not support. You supported an opponent. There's a recall of Mr. Boudin. You've not said where you are on this. Are you ready? Are you prepared to do that now?
Well, I am doing everything I can as mayor to keep people in San Francisco safe. And part of that means I have to have a good working relationship with our district attorney. At the end of the day, that is our primary responsibility, and I am doing everything I can to focus on that. Ultimately, there has been a lot of negative attention paid to San Francisco about some of those videos that have gone viral. But what doesn't get talked about is the work that our police department has done to make the arrest, to try and hold people accountable. So we're going to continue to do that. And part of what I have to do is everything I can to work with the district attorney, regardless of what's happening as it relates to a recall.
Well, one could argue you have to work with the school board. You were willing to come out publicly about the school board recall. You feel like your relationship's too close to Mr. Boudin in this instance?
Well, it's a little bit different with the school board. I didn't necessarily have to work with all the school board members. There were several members on the board that I did have a good working relationship with, and I had a good working relationship with the superintendent. So I would say that it's different. I haven't made a decision one way or another about the recall. I'm still debating on whether or not I will, but ultimately what I want to be able to do is make sure that the decision I make is not an impediment to my ability to work with the district attorney and keeping San Franciscans safe.
Do you expect there to be some crossover between the frustrations that voters showed with school board members and perhaps the frustrations they could be showing in this recall with the district attorney?
I think that, you know, when we look at what's happening in San Francisco and the concerns around crime, people are definitely frustrated about accountability because, again, the police are making the arrests in many of these cases, and what we want are people to be held accountable. I grew up in San Francisco. I grew up in public housing. I grew up in a very challenging environment, and it's not that people don't want police. We can have police reform and also ensure safety with making sure that police are present when a crime is committed, and the district attorney's responsibility is to make sure that when the evidence is presented, that those people are held accountable.
Mayor London Breed, the mayor of San Francisco, really appreciate you coming on and sharing your perspective with us. Thank you.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.
This Sunday, the threat from Russia.
We are ready no matter what happens.
More Russian troops massing on Ukraine's border.
Russia's aggression today not only threatened Ukraine, it also threatens Europe.
The U.S. sends 3,000 troops to Eastern Europe.
We're going to make sure we reassure our NATO allies in Eastern Europe that we're there.
Vladimir Putin breaks his silence and says the U.S. is ignoring Russia's security concerns.
When he puts 100,000 troops along the border, I think we should be prepared for further incursions.
And gains an ally in America's superpower rival, China. My guest this morning, President Biden's National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan. Plus, Pence rebukes Trump.
President Trump is wrong. I had no right to overturn the election.
Mike Pence responds to Donald Trump's claims he could have overturned the election. This as the RNC censures Representatives Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger for participating in the January 6th investigation.
All of those in favor of the motion, please signify by saying aye.
Aye. And calls the Capitol riot legitimate political discourse. I'll talk to Mr. Pence's former chief of staff, Mark Short. And the NFL's race problem.
I think the numbers speak for themselves. One black head coach.
Some 20 years after the league pledged to do better, why do NFL coaches still look like the old boys club? Joining me for insight and analysis are former Homeland Security Secretary Jay Johnson, Amy Walter, editor-in-chief and publisher of the Cook Political Report, Matthew Continetti of the American Enterprise Institute, and Helene Cooper, Pentagon correspondent for the New York Times. Welcome to Sunday. It's Meet the Press.
From NBC News in Washington, the longest-running show in television history. This is Meet the Press with Chuck Todd.
And a good Sunday morning. In 2008, during the Summer Olympic Games in Beijing, Russian troops invaded neighboring Georgia. The then Prime Minister of Russia, Vladimir Putin, declared from Beijing, war has started. In 2014, Russian troops moved into Crimea just days after Putin returned from the Winter Olympics in Sochi. And now with the Winter Games underway in Beijing and with Putin in attendance, the world is left to guess, is Putin about to pull the trigger again, this time on Ukraine? U.S. plans for a diplomatic boycott of the Games have largely fizzled, and Putin has found an ally in China's leader, Xi Jinping. On Friday, Putin met with Xi, who offered strong support for Russia in its standoff with the West, at least publicly. The two issued a joint statement saying friendship between the two states has no limits. China has offered political support to Russia over Ukraine, including blocking U.S.-sponsored action at the UN Security Council. Our chief foreign correspondent, Richard Engel, has been covering the buildup of Russia's military forces. He's on the border of Russia and Ukraine and eastern Ukraine. And Richard, this is a case, I think, of watch what they do, don't necessarily listen to what Russia says. What do you see, Richard?
Well, we're seeing a massive military buildup. This is unlike anything I've seen since the American 2003 buildup before it launched the war in Iraq. And I think that's why you're
പാരിജാതത്തിൻ്റെ